Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Greg Wilpert, coming to you from Quito, Ecuador. As citizens in the United States prepare to file their taxes for 2017, many are confronted with the uncomfortable fact that despite President Trump's promise, they will probably have to pay slightly more in taxes this time around. The people that are most likely to see a tax increase are those who live in high-tax states such as California, New York, and New Jersey, and who used to be able to deduct all of their state and local taxes from their income for calculating their federal taxes. The state and local tax deduction, also known as SALT deduction, is now capped at $10,000. What will be the consequences not only for the taxpayer but also for those states and cities with higher tax rates? And can they do anything about this? Joining me to analyze the SALT deduction and what states can do about it is Dean Baker. Dean is senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and is the author of Rigged: How Globalization and the Rules of the Modern Economy Were Structured to Make the Rich Richer. Welcome back, Dean.
Thanks for having me on.
So why, briefly, is limiting the SALT deduction to $10,000 a problem? Isn't the main effect to raise taxes for those who are more able to pay more taxes, that is, for higher income people?
Well, it certainly generally hits higher income people. So the basic story, if you put the cap at 10,000, most people will be under it. But it's not hard, particularly in a higher tax state and a state also with higher property taxes like California and New York, that even a fairly middle income person could be above that. So it's totally plausible in those states that someone has a home that's worth $900,000. Maybe they bought it 20 years ago and cost half or a third as much. They could have $10,000 in property taxes alone, which means that whatever they pay in state income taxes, they're going to lose the deduction on that. But it obviously, higher up you go, the more impact it is. And on the one hand, I'm not troubled by higher income people paying more money. But the reality is that these people have a lot of power. So there's two issues from the standpoint of a state like California or New York. One is that you could simply have people move. Now, that's exaggerated. People have, a lot of the Republicans were sort of gleeful saying, oh, okay, all these people are going to move from high tax states to Texas or other lower tax states. Well, that's not going to happen in mass. Surely there'll be some, and that is somewhat of an issue. They exaggerate that, but it's not zero. They also could play games. So someone might say they live in Texas. They have a house in Texas and they're living there and use that to try and avoid paying some of their taxes in California and New York. So you will see some of that. But the other thing is that obviously this costs them more money, and these are powerful people, and they will use their political power to, at the very least, prevent any further tax increases, but they will try to have their taxes rolled back because now, in effect, they're paying 40% more. If you could deduct this against the old 39.6% tax rate, 40% of your state and local taxes were paid by the federal government. Now 100% is paid by yourself. So there would be pressure to lower the taxes. The reason why I'm so concerned about that is that these are the places where you see progressive policies. You see in New York or California looking to expand Medicaid coverage, other healthcare coverage, looking to extend free college. Their ability to do that's going to be seriously limited if this were to stay in place as the Republicans have proposed it.
So you recently published a fairly detailed proposal for how states could get around the SALT deduction and the limit, that is, by turning income taxes into a payroll tax. How would this work, and how would it help states and taxpayers?
Well, basic story is you take some portion of the state income tax and you reduce the state income tax by roughly that amount, let's say 5 percentage points. In New York, their tax is roughly 5 percentage points. It's somewhat progressive, so for higher income people, it's more than that. But suppose you had a state employer side payroll tax of 5 percentage points, and you have a zero bracket, so everyone doesn't pay it. You have to earn above, say, 15,000. Governor Cuomo's actually just proposed something along these lines, and he has it at 40,000. But whatever, you have some zero bracket, and then you pay 5%. Your employer, I should say, pay 5% on your wages above 40,000 in the case of what Cuomo's proposed. Well, you're reducing your state income tax by that amount. So if you're subject to a 5% state income tax, basically you'd pay zero. For higher income people who might have paid an 8% tax in the case of New York, they'd instead pay a 3% tax. What that would mean is that the bulk of the tax that they get, that they're subject to for the state, would still be deductible because the employer side payroll tax would be deductible for them. The conventional view among economists, let's stick with the 5% number. We'll just say it comes at $0. It starts at your first dollar of your paycheck. Suppose you earned $100,000 and we tell your employer they have to pay a 5% tax on your wages. Well, what we'd expect to happen is that over time, they will reduce your wages accordingly so that they're paying 5% tax on your wages. Instead of you getting paid 100,000, you'll get paid 95,000. Now that leaves you the exact same spot relative to the state government, because before you used to get 100,000, you had to send the state a check for 5,000. Now you're getting 95,000. The difference is at the federal level, you're only being taxed on 95,000, not 100,000. So in effect, you've preserved the deductibility of the income tax that gets paid to the state. And as I said, Governor Cuomo seems intent on going this route, which to my view is a very good idea.
So let's turn to some of the complications of this proposal. First, how realistic is it to expect taxes to completely rewrite their tax laws on such a fundamental level? I mean, you mentioned that Governor Cuomo is considering it, and of course, this would have to pass the legislature. Wouldn't this require a pretty fundamental rewriting of the state tax code?
It requires a rewriting. In many cases, I believe New York's in this situation, but most states already had their tax code tied to the federal tax code, which would require rewriting in any case. So the federal government doubled the standard deduction. So states that had tied their standard deduction to the federal one will have to change that. They got rid of the personal exemption. So many states had the personal exemption tied to the federal government's personal exemption. So many states, most states, I'm sure, have to redo their tax code anyhow. In terms of the complexity, it really isn't that complex. I mean, people can make it sound complex. And, if I just sat down with someone and just said, hey, do this, it would take most people a while to figure out. But the reality is, from the standpoint of people who do like withholding schedules for companies, this is fairly straightforward. I mean, you just have to give them the formula, they plug it in. And from the standpoint of you and I as taxpayers, it's very simple. So this is not some incredibly complex story. And again, since we're redoing the tax code anyhow, this isn't a huge further complication.
And another issue that has perhaps been raised is that currently most high tax states have a progressive income tax. Wouldn't introducing a payroll tax like this be regressive in the sense that it's a flat tax?
Not at all, because you're leaving the progressive aspect in place. So in the example I gave before, New York State, which has for most people, they'd be looking at roughly a 5% income tax. Higher income people would be paying 8%. I think it peaks out at like 8.4, 8.5. What you would do is you'd leave in that tax for higher income people. So for more middle income people, basically the payroll tax would substitute 5% payroll tax for a 5% income tax. For higher income people, they would pay the 5% payroll tax, and then they would also pay 3% income tax on top of that. So you haven't changed the progressivity at all. At least there's no reason to. I mean, obviously, if the state's reconsidering its tax code, they can do whatever they want. But there's no reason why this should be any less progressive, and it could even be made more progressive than the current structure.
But then the other issue is that not only would state tax laws have to be written, but also employment contracts, basically, so that employers don't carry all of the tax burden. Wouldn't both employers and employees resist such a change?
Well, two things. One is you would look to phase it in. Cuomo's look at phasing it in over 3 years, which is what I'd recommended. I mean, not that they're necessarily taking their advice from me, but I mean, that would be a reasonable time frame. The second point is that it contracts, well, I'm saying 3 years, many contracts will expire there, but also people typically are getting wage increases currently about 2.5% a year on average. What that would mean is you're not looking at cutting anyone's pay, or at least not for the most part. What you're basically talking about is people would get somewhat lower pay increases. Again, it's being offset by paying less taxes to the state. But instead of someone looking at, say, a 2.5% pay increase, they're looking at a 0.5% or 1% pay increase this year and next year, with the difference being made up by paying lower taxes to the state of New York.
And finally, your paper points out that since employers are paying the tax directly via payroll tax, then employees would be paid less and therefore would have to pay less in Social Security and Medicare. But wouldn't that mean that their Social Security benefits would be lower when they retire?
Well, this is, you could see it as a bonus or a cost to it. Not only does this increase their exemption for federal income taxes, it also in effect makes their state taxes deductible from the standpoint of Social Security and Medicare taxes. So they'll pay less in those taxes as well. The downside, as you suggest, it does mean somewhat lower Social Security. Now, realistically, when you try to do some calculations, you say for someone earning $50,000 a year, $60,000 a year, you're talking about lowering their Social Security payment maybe a few $100s if this were in place for their whole working career. So it's a relatively small impact on people's Social Security. Again, I'm not a fan of seeing Social Security cut, but you are seeing a relatively small impact. But the other point I'd make on that is my expectation would be that suppose New York does this, and certainly Governor Cuomo's looking to. I mean, he's put it on the table and he's going to try and push it through the legislature. I assume he's serious about it. He's not wasting his time. And other states follow. There'll be pressure for more states to do it because I suspect most people would rather pay less tax than more. And since your legislature could do this fix and have you pay less tax. So as more states start to do it, it makes pressure on the federal government to say, okay, this was stupid. Let's go back and rewrite it. So my hope would be that, let's say New York State does something like this, California's looking in a similar direction, some other states go, then in Washington, whether it's still a Republican Congress or, if you get Democrats there, they go, okay, let's rewrite this. This is stupid to have states doing this. It's costing us revenue in a way that doesn't make sense. Let's go back and put back something like the pre-existing rules where the state and local taxes were deductible against people's income tax. That would be my expectation.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now. I'm speaking to Dean Baker, Senior Economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thanks for having joined us today, Dean.
Sure, thanks for having me on.
And I'm Greg Wilpert for the Real News Network.